October 15th, 2023. Sylvester Stallone had owned the cabin for exactly 3 days when his dog started digging behind the woodshed. Bruno, his 12-year-old German shepherd, had never shown interest in anything but tennis balls and bacon. Now he was clawing at frozen earth like his life depended on it. What Bruno found that morning changed everything Stallone thought he knew about his past. A rusted metal box. Inside, film reels that should have been destroyed 47 years ago. Photographs of a young actress who died accidentally on the Rocky set in 1976. And a confession letter signed by Vincent Torino, the missing stuntman who knew where all the bodies were buried. The Hollywood machine had spent decades burying this secret. They'd killed to protect it, and now Stallone held the evidence in his hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Stallone's hands trembled as he held the confession letter, the yellowed paper crackling between his fingers like autumn leaves. The morning air cut through his leather jacket, but the chill running down his spine had nothing to do with the October cold. By the time someone reads this, I'll either be dead or long gone. My name is Vincent Torino, and I saw what they did to Melissa Chen on October 3rd, 1976. It wasn't an accident. She was going to talk about what happened in Balboa's trailer, so they made sure she couldn't. Bruno whined softly, his massive head tilted toward the tree line. The dog's ears were pinned back, alert to something Stallone couldn't hear. 47 years in this business had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every nerve was screaming danger. The cabin sat isolated on 12 acres of Adirondack wilderness, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. Stallone had bought it for the solitude, desperate to escape the endless meetings, the young executives who spoke to him like he was a museum piece, the constant pressure to reinvent himself for audiences who barely remembered his glory days. He'd wanted peace. Instead, he'd stumbled into a nightmare. Melissa Chen. He remembered her, barely 22, brought in for a small role as a waitress in Mickey's gym scene. Beautiful, eager, with dreams of stardom dancing in her dark eyes. The official report said she'd fallen down a flight of stairs at the hotel, broke her neck. Tragic accident. Production delayed by 2 days, then business as usual. But Vinnie Torino had seen something different. And 3 weeks after Melissa's death, Vinnie had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and unpaid rent. Stallone's phone buzzed against his chest. He pulled it out with his free hand, keeping the confession letter pressed against his body to shield it from the wind. Unknown number. Yeah? Silence. Then a voice, gravelly with age and fear. You found it. The words hit him like a physical blow. Who is this? You know who this is, Sly. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Stallone spun around, scanning the dense forest that pressed in on all sides. Somewhere in those shadows, Vincent Torino was watching him. Still alive after all these years. Vinnie? Jesus Christ, where are you? Everyone thinks you're dead. Dead would have been easier. A bitter laugh crackled through the phone. I've been living like a ghost for 30 years, waiting for someone to buy this place. Someone who wasn't part of their machine. Bruno suddenly bolted toward the tree line, barking sharply. Stallone's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched his dog disappear into the undergrowth. Your dog's smart, Vinnie's voice continued through the phone. Smells the fear on me. I haven't been this close to civilization in months. Why didn't you go to the police? The FBI? Another laugh, harsher this time. You think I didn't try? You know how deep this goes, Sly. How much money was riding on Rocky? How many careers got launched off that film? They had cops, judges, studio heads, all of them invested in keeping that story buried. The confession letter fluttered in Stallone's grip. His eyes caught on another line. The man who killed her is still out there, still working, still respected. And if anyone tries to expose what really happened, they'll end up like Melissa. Who was it, Vinnie? Who killed her? The line went dead. Stallone stared at his phone, then at the metal box at his feet. 3 film reels lay nestled in rotted foam padding, their labels faded but still legible. Rocky, deleted scenes, Balboa trailer int. Below them, a stack of photographs bound with a rubber band that crumbled at his touch. The first photo made his stomach lurch. Melissa Chen, but not the vibrant young woman he remembered. This version was broken, her face swollen, her clothes torn. Someone had written on the back in blue ink before they fixed her. Bruno's barking echoed through the forest, growing more distant. Stallone shoved the photos and letter back into the box, grabbed the film reels and headed for the cabin. Whatever was on those reels, someone had been willing to kill to keep it hidden. As he reached the porch steps, his phone buzzed again. Text message from the same unknown number. They know you're here. Saw the smoke from your chimney yesterday. If you want answers, meet me at the old logging road tonight, midnight. Come alone, and sly, bring a gun. Stallone looked back at the forest where Bruno had vanished, then at the film reels in his hands. 47 years ago, he'd been so focused on making his dream come true that he'd been blind to the nightmare happening around him. Now the past had come calling, and running wasn't an option. The Hollywood machine that had made him a legend was about to become his deadliest enemy. Have you ever discovered something you wished you could forget? Drop a comment below and let me know if Stallone should trust Vinny or run. And if you're hooked on this mystery, hit that follow button. Tomorrow we dive deeper into Melissa Chen's final hours, and trust me, you won't see the next twist coming. The silence felt heavier than the film reels in Stallone's hands as he climbed the cabin steps, each weathered board groaning under his weight like old bones. Bruno's distant barking had faded to nothing, swallowed by the vast Adirondack wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. For the first time since arriving 3 days ago, the isolation he'd craved felt more like a trap than sanctuary. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and decades of neglect. Stallone set the film reels on the rough-hewn dining table, his fingers lingering on the dusty canisters that contained God only knew what horrors. The morning light streaming through grimy windows caught the metal surfaces, casting dancing reflections across knotty pine walls adorned with faded hunting photos and a mounted deer head whose glassy eyes seemed to watch his every move. He'd bought this place sight unseen through a realtor in Lake Placid, desperate for anywhere that didn't have paparazzi lurking behind manicured hedges or studio executives dropping by with exciting opportunities that were really just rehashes of his past glories. At 77, he was tired of being Sylvester Stallone, the brand. He just wanted to be Sly again, the hungry kid from Hell's Kitchen who'd once believed movies could change the world. The irony wasn't lost on him that Vincent Torino's cabin had chosen him, not the other way around. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. Jennifer's name lit up the screen, and his chest tightened with familiar worry. His eldest daughter had been calling every morning since he'd retreated to the mountains, her voice always carrying that careful tone children used when they thought their parent was losing his mind. "Hi, sweetheart." "Dad, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours." The relief in her voice made him feel guilty for not answering sooner. "How are you? Really?" Stallone glanced at the film reels, then out the window toward the forest where Bruno had vanished. How could he explain that the simple retirement escape she'd encouraged him to take had become a journey into his darkest past? That somewhere in these woods lurked a man presumed dead for 3 decades, carrying secrets that could destroy everything Stallone had built? "I'm fine, Jen. Just needed some space to think. The girls keep asking when Grandpa's coming home." She paused, and he could picture her in her Santa Monica kitchen, probably making breakfast for his granddaughters while juggling her own career demands. "Sophia made you a drawing of Bruno. She's convinced he misses his favorite tennis ball." The mention of his granddaughters sent a warm ache through his chest. Sophia, 8 years old and fearless, who insisted on being called Rocky Jr. when they sparred with foam gloves in his gym. Sistine, 10, quieter but sharp as a blade, who'd inherited his love of old movies and could quote Casablanca scene for scene. They were his anchor to the future, living proof that the Stallone legacy could be more than just celluloid heroes and manufactured legends. Now that legacy felt fragile as spun glass. "Tell them Grandpa and Bruno are having an adventure," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "We'll be home soon." But even as he spoke the words, Stallone knew they might be a lie. Whatever was on these film reels, whatever Vincent Torino had witnessed all those years ago, it wouldn't stay buried. The text message still burned in his memory. "They know you're here." Who were they? Studio executives protecting old secrets? The killer Vinny claimed was still alive, still working, still respected, or something worse. A network of power and money that had grown stronger over the decades, feeding off silence and fear. Dad? Jennifer's voice pulled him back to the present. You sound strange. Are you sure you're okay? Just tired, honey. This mountain air makes me sleepy. Another lie, smoother than the first. He'd learned long ago how to perform, how to give people the version of himself they needed to see. But the weight of protecting his family from this nightmare was already crushing him. I love you. Kiss the girls for me. After he hung up, Stallone stared at the phone for a long moment, Jennifer's contact photo smiling back at him. His daughter at last year's Christmas dinner, surrounded by his granddaughters in the warm chaos of family life. Everything he'd worked for, everything that mattered more than any Oscar or box office record. A sharp bark echoed from outside, and relief flooded through him as Bruno emerged from the tree line, tongue lolling but otherwise unharmed. The German shepherd bounded toward the cabin with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age, though Stallone noticed the slight hitch in his gait that spoke of 12 years of faithful companionship. Bruno had been with him through 3 divorces, career disappointments, health scares, and the slow, grinding realization that Hollywood no longer needed aging action heroes. The dog was family, pure and simple. As Bruno climbed the porch steps, Stallone noticed something clenched in his jaws. Not a stick or forest debris, but something metallic that caught the morning light. Another piece of Vincent Torino's buried truth, waiting to surface after decades in the dark. Stallone's heart sank as he recognized the object in Bruno's mouth. A tarnished brass key, dark with age and forest soil. The dog dropped it at his feet with a proud wag, as if delivering a prized fetch stick, oblivious to the dread creeping up Stallone's spine like cold fingers. He picked up the key, feeling its surprising weight. An address was engraved on the metal surface in block letters. 1247, Mulholland Doctor, Unit 7. Below that, barely legible scratches that looked like MC Melissa Chen. The implications hit him like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just evidence of a decades-old crime. It was a key to somewhere in Los Angeles. Somewhere that might still exist. Somewhere that might contain more truth than he was prepared to handle. Bruno whined softly, nudging against Stallone's leg. The dog's eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved him, as if the animal could sense the weight of human secrets better than any person. Where had he found this? How many more pieces of Vincent Torino's puzzle were scattered through these woods? Stallone's phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. The same unknown number from before. Vinny? You found the key. The voice was closer now, less distorted. Vincent Torino was nearby, probably watching from the tree line. Smart dog you got there. Smarter than most of the people I used to work with. Where are you? Close enough to keep an eye on things. Far enough to run if I need to. A pause filled with the sound of wind through pine trees. That key opens a storage unit I rented in '76. Been paying for it through a shell company ever since, waiting for the right moment. Stallone's grip tightened on his phone. What's in it? Everything they thought they destroyed. Film negatives, witness statements, police reports that never made it to court. Even recordings. Did you know they were already using wiretaps back then? Studio security was paranoid about actors talking to reporters. The weight of 30 years of hidden truth pressed down on Stallone's shoulders. He thought of Jennifer's voice, worried but trusting. Of his granddaughters who saw him as an invincible hero from their favorite movies. Of the life he'd built on the foundation of Rocky's success. A foundation that was apparently cracked with blood and covered in lies. Why now, Vinny? Why wait all these years? Because I was scared. The admission came out raw, stripped of pretense. You think it's easy living like a ghost, watching from the shadows, while the bastards who killed Melissa got promoted, got honored, got to live normal lives? But I was just a stuntman. Nobody would have believed me then. And you think they'll believe you now? They'll believe Sylvester Stallone. Vincent's voice carried a bitter hope. You're not just some working stiff they can disappear. You got resources, connections, credibility. You're the only one who can make this stick. Stallone stared at the key, its brass surface warming under his palm. The smart move would be to throw it in the lake, burn the film reels, and pretend he'd never found Vincent's confession. Go back to Los Angeles, hug his granddaughters, and live out his remaining years in blissful ignorance. But Melissa Chen's broken face haunted him from the photographs. 22 years old, full of dreams, silenced before she could expose whatever horror she'd witnessed in that trailer. How many others had there been? How many young actors and actresses had suffered while he'd been too focused on his own career to notice? The storage unit, Stallone said finally. Is it safe? Safer than here. They know about the cabin now, saw the smoke from your chimney, like I said. But the storage facility? That's been invisible for 30 years. Even I almost forgot about it until last month when the shell company sent a renewal notice. Bruno suddenly stiffened. His ears perked toward the access road that wound through the forest to the main highway. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Not the playful sound he'd made earlier, but something deeper, more primal. Vinny, I think. I hear it too. Car engines. 2, maybe 3 vehicles. Vincent's voice turned sharp with fear. They're coming up the mountain road. Jesus Christ, they're actually coming. Through the trees, Stallone caught a glimpse of black SUVs winding their way up the narrow dirt track. Professional vehicles with tinted windows, moving with the measured pace of people who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Get out of there, Sly. Now, take the key, take your dog, and run. The old logging trail behind your cabin leads down to Route 73. There's a gas station about 3 miles south. Steal a car, buy a car, whatever it takes. Get to Los Angeles. The phone line crackled with static as the first SUV came into view through the pines. What about you? I've had 30 years of practice disappearing. Vincent's laugh held no humor. Go. Find out what's in that storage unit. Melissa Chen deserves better than dying for nothing. The line went dead as the lead SUV's engine grew louder, closer, inevitable. Stallone stood frozen on the porch as the rumble of engines grew louder, his mind racing through possibilities that all ended badly. 3 SUVs meant at least 6 people, probably more, professional hunters who'd tracked him to this remote corner of the Adirondacks with the efficiency of a military operation. His first instinct was to grab the Glock he'd packed, old habits from a paranoid industry. But Vincent's words echoed in his skull, run. Bruno sensed his master's panic and pressed against his legs, a warm anchor in the chaos of fear. Stallone shoved the storage key deep into his pocket, grabbed the film reels from the table, and bolted for the back door. The confession letter and photographs went into his jacket as he burst onto the rear deck, scanning the forest for the logging trail Vincent had mentioned. There, a gap in the pines about 50 yards behind the cabin, barely visible but wide enough for a man and dog. Stallone jumped the deck railing and hit the ground running, his 77-year-old knees protesting with every impact. Behind him, car doors slammed with military precision. No shouting, no chaos. These weren't amateurs. The logging trail was overgrown but passable, winding downhill through dense forest that would provide cover if they could move fast enough. Bruno loped beside him with the easy grace of a younger dog, adrenaline masking his age just as it masked Stallone's own physical limitations. Fear was a hell of a performance enhancer. Halfway down the mountain, Stallone's phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, then saw Jennifer's name and answered while still running. Dad? I just saw something on the news. Her voice was tight with worry. There's been an incident at a cabin in the Adirondacks. Police are calling it a gas leak explosion, but the footage looks like... Jen, listen to me. Stallone forced himself to sound calm while his lungs burned. I'm fine, but I need you to do something. Take the girls and go to your mother's house in Malibu. Don't ask questions, just do it. Silence. Then, Dad, you're scaring me. What's happening? Promise me you'll go. Today. Right now. Okay. But you have to tell me. I will. Soon. I love you. He hung up before she could respond, hating himself for the fear he'd heard in her voice. The gas station emerged through the trees like salvation, a rundown building with 2 pumps and a hand-painted sign advertising bait and beer. Stallone approached carefully, checking for other customers or security cameras. Empty except for a bored teenager behind bulletproof glass who barely looked up from his phone. An old Ford pickup sat beside the air pump, keys dangling from the ignition. Small-town trust that was about to be violated by necessity. Stallone slipped the owner 20 hundreds through the night slot, enough to buy 3 used trucks, and drove away with Bruno panting in the passenger seat. The 8-hour drive to Los Angeles passed in a blur of interstate highways and mounting dread. Every black SUV in his rearview mirror might be surveillance. Every rest stop could be a trap. Stallone kept the radio tuned to news stations, waiting for reports about the missing Hollywood icon, but heard only the usual political theater and celebrity gossip. They wanted this quiet. Whatever had happened at the cabin, whoever they were, public attention was the last thing they needed. By the time he reached the storage facility on Mulholland Drive, darkness had fallen over the city like a familiar blanket. The building was older than he'd expected, probably built in the 1960s, back when this part of the hills was still accessible to working people. Unit 7 sat at the end of a dimly lit corridor that reeked of dust and old secrets. The brass key turned easily, but the door had swollen with age and required his shoulder to budge. Inside, motion-activated lights flickered to life, revealing Vincent Torino's time capsule. File boxes lined the walls, each labeled with dates spanning 1975 to 1977. A corkboard covered in photographs showed the players in Melissa Chen's story. Studio executives, police detectives, and faces Stallone recognized from Rocky's production crew. Red string connected images like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But this wasn't paranoia. This was methodical documentation by a man who'd known he was living on borrowed time. Bruno whined softly as they entered, his sensitive nose detecting sense of fear and obsession that had saturated this space for decades. In the center of the room sat an old film projector aimed at a white sheet stretched across the back wall. Stallone approached the first file box with trembling hands. The label read, Melissa Chen, Final Days. Inside, police photographs showed her hotel room exactly as Vincent had described. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just a beautiful young woman with a broken neck, arranged to look like an accident. But underneath the official photos, he found Vincent's hidden evidence. Images of bruising that didn't match a fall, witness statements that had never made it into police reports, and a coroner's preliminary findings that had been mysteriously revised hours before the official autopsy. Someone with serious power had orchestrated Melissa's death and the subsequent cover-up. Someone who was still alive, still working, still respected, just as Vincent's confession letter had warned. As Stallone lifted the first film reel toward the projector, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk." The text message hung on his screen like a digital noose. Stallone stared at the words, his finger hovering over the phone's keyboard, when Bruno suddenly bolted toward the storage unit's entrance, hackles raised and teeth bared at shadows that shouldn't have been moving. "Easy, boy." But Stallone's own voice betrayed his fear as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Professional, measured. The same calculated approach he'd heard at the cabin before Vincent's warning had saved his life. The storage facility's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting stuttering shadows across the evidence that Vincent had spent decades collecting. 30 years of meticulous documentation, and now Stallone might have led them straight to it. The weight of that responsibility, of being the weak link in a chain Vincent had died to protect, crushed down on him like a physical force. Another text arrived, Unit 7. "Come out with your hands visible. We just want to talk." They knew exactly where he was. How long had they been tracking him? Since the cabin? Since he'd bought the property? Or had this started the moment his name appeared on those old Rocky production documents, a loose thread in a tapestry of secrets that someone was desperate to keep intact? Stallone's hands shook as he loaded the film reel into Vincent's projector. If these were his final moments, he needed to see what Melissa Chen had died for. The ancient machine hummed to life, casting grainy light onto the makeshift screen. The footage began with standard behind-the-scenes material. Crew members setting up equipment, actors reviewing scripts, the casual chaos of film production. But Vincent's camera had captured something else. Faces in the background, whispered conversations between people who thought they were unobserved. Then Melissa appeared on screen, and Stallone's breath caught in his throat. She was even younger than the police photographs had suggested, barely out of college, with eyes full of wonder at being part of something magical. The camera followed her as she moved between sets, occasionally speaking with other actors, always professional, always eager to please. But as the footage progressed, Vincent's lens began focusing on specific interactions. Melissa talking privately with a man Stallone recognized as Harold Kemper, one of Rocky's executive producers. The conversation looked heated, uncomfortable, Melissa shaking her head repeatedly while Kemper leaned closer, his body language increasingly aggressive. The film cut to another scene, Melissa emerging from a trailer, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears. She looked directly into Vincent's hidden camera for just a moment, and the desperation in her eyes transcended decades of celluloid. A young woman who'd discovered something terrible and had nowhere to turn. She was going to expose them. Whatever she'd seen, whatever Kemper had demanded of her, Melissa had chosen to fight back, and it had killed her. "Mr. Stallone." The voice came from directly outside the storage unit now, calm and professional. "My name is Margaret Walsh. I represent certain parties who have a vested interest in resolving this situation peacefully." Through the gap under the door, Stallone could see multiple pairs of expensive shoes. Not thugs or hired muscle, but corporate fixers. The kind of people who solved problems with legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements rather than violence. Unless, of course, those methods failed. "We know this appears threatening," Walsh continued, "but we're not here to harm you. Mr. Torino has been feeding you incomplete information. There are aspects of Melissa Chen's death that he never understood, circumstances that required difficult decisions to protect innocent people. Innocent people." The phrase sent rage boiling through Stallone's veins. Melissa had been innocent, 22 years old with her whole life ahead of her, silenced because she'd threatened someone's reputation or profit margin. On screen, the footage shifted to what looked like security camera footage. Grainy, black and white, time-stamped the night Melissa died. The hotel corridor outside her room. For hours, nothing. Then, at 2:17 a.m., a figure appeared, male, well-dressed, moving with purpose toward Melissa's door. The man turned slightly as he reached for the handle, and Stallone's blood froze. He recognized that profile. Older now, more distinguished, but unmistakably the same person who'd presented him with a Lifetime Achievement Award just 6 months ago. Someone who'd built an empire on the foundation of that night's work. Who'd smiled and shaken Stallone's hand while carrying Melissa's death like a secret poison in his heart. "Mr. Stallone," Walsh's voice carried a note of impatience now, "we can't allow you to leave with that material, but we're prepared to offer substantial compensation for your cooperation. Enough to ensure your family's security for generations." His family. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They weren't just talking about money, they were talking about protection. The kind of protection that implied consequences if he refused. Bruno growled low in his throat, sensing his master's anguish. The dog's loyalty was absolute, unconditional, the kind of pure devotion that had vanished from most human relationships decades ago. Whatever happened next, at least Stallone wouldn't face it alone. The projector continued running, showing footage that could destroy careers, topple empires, and finally give Melissa Chen the justice she'd been denied. But at what cost? Jennifer's worried voice echoed in his memory, his granddaughter's trusting smiles. Outside, Walsh's patience was clearly wearing thin. The projector suddenly clicked, the film reel reaching its end, and in the mechanical silence that followed, Stallone heard something that made his blood turn to ice, the distinctive wheeze of labored breathing coming from the dark corner behind the file boxes. "Hello, Sly." The voice was older, raspier, but unmistakably familiar. Vincent Torino stepped into the flickering light, very much alive, holding a small recording device that had been capturing every word of Walsh's negotiation. Stallone's mind reeled. The frantic phone call from the cabin, the desperate warnings about running, the supposed gas leak explosion that had forced him to steal a truck and flee across the country in terror. All of it, theater. "You son of a bitch." The words came out as a whisper, but carried the weight of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You've been here the whole time." Vincent's weathered face showed no remorse, only the grim satisfaction of a man whose 30-year plan was finally bearing fruit. "Had to make it believable, didn't I? They needed to think you were running scared, acting on emotion instead of calculation. Corporate sharks like Walsh, they can smell a setup from miles away unless the target genuinely believes he's in danger." Bruno snarled. the dog's instincts finally catching up to what his master had just realized. Everything about Vincent's performance had been perfectly calibrated. The mysterious phone calls, the dramatic reveal of evidence, even the timing of those approaching vehicles. Stallone had been played with the skill of a master manipulator who'd had 3 decades to perfect his approach. "My family," Stallone said, his voice hollow with growing horror. "I sent them into hiding because of you. They're perfectly safe. Always were." Vincent moved closer, and now Stallone could see the cold calculation behind eyes he'd mistaken for desperate honesty. "But Walsh doesn't know that. From her perspective, you're a terrified old man who stumbled onto evidence that could destroy her clients. She's operating from a position of assumed strength, which means she'll get careless." The truth hit Stallone like a physical blow. "You're recording this. All of it. Her threats, her admissions, everything. 30 years I've been waiting for someone with your profile to walk into this mess," Vincent said, holding up the device. "Someone they couldn't simply disappear. Someone whose involvement would guarantee media attention if anything happened to him. You were never the investigator, Sly. You were the bait." Outside the storage unit, Walsh's voice had taken on a sharper edge. "Mr. Stallone, we know you're not alone in there. Mr. Torino, if you're listening, you should understand that your little game ends here. We've tolerated your existence for 30 years because you posed no real threat. That tolerance has its limits." Vincent's smile was predatory. "There it is. First admission that they've known I was alive all along. Keep talking, Margaret." The casual betrayal of it, the way Vincent spoke his name, as if they were old friends instead of hunter and prey, filled Stallone with a rage that burned away the last of his confusion. He'd been manipulated by Hollywood executives his entire career, but this was different. This was personal. "You used me." The words came out flat, empty of the emotion churning beneath. My grief over my son, my need for escape, my guilt about not knowing what happened during Rocky. "You researched me, didn't you? Studied my psychology like I was just another mark." "I studied everyone connected to those productions," Vincent admitted without a trace of shame. "Took me 15 years to identify the right candidate. Someone with enough star power to force their hand, enough personal trauma to make the manipulation believable, and enough moral flexibility to—" "Moral flexibility?" Stallone's voice cracked like a whip. Vincent's eyes glittered with something ugly. "Come on, Sly. You think you got the Rocky role purely on talent? You think Apollo Creed's tragic arc wrote itself? This industry's been built on compromises and buried secrets since day one. You've just been lucky enough to stay ignorant of the price tag." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Every doubt Stallone had ever harbored about his meteoric rise, every whispered rumor about the circumstances that had launched his career, suddenly crystallized into sickening possibility. Vincent hadn't just manipulated his present, he was poisoning his past. But Walsh's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Fine. You want to know the truth about Melissa Chen? She wasn't some innocent victim. She was blackmailing half the production staff with compromising photographs. Her death was unfortunate, but it saved a dozen careers and prevented the kind of scandal that would have destroyed the entire project." Vincent raised the recording device triumphantly, but Stallone could only stare at the man who'd orchestrated his psychological destruction with the calculating precision of a master filmmaker. The worst part wasn't being used. It was realizing how perfectly Vincent had understood him. The recording device in Vincent's hand suddenly felt like the most important object in the world, and the most dangerous. Stallone watched the small red light blink steadily as Walsh continued talking outside, each word another nail in the coffin of a conspiracy that had survived for 3 decades. She was extorting people. Stallone. Walsh's voice carried clearly through the thin door. Taking photographs at parties, recording private conversations, threatening to destroy marriages and careers unless she got better roles, more money. We tried to handle it quietly, but she became increasingly unstable. Vincent's eyes gleamed as he adjusted the device's position. This was what he'd waited for. Not just an admission of knowledge, but justification. The kind of detailed confession that transformed speculation into legal evidence. But Stallone felt something breaking apart inside his chest. Not just the revelation about Melissa, though that hit hard enough. It was the cold realization that every emotion he'd experienced over the past week, the grief, the determination, the protective fury, had been orchestrated by a man who'd studied him like a lab specimen. "How long?" The words came out hoarse. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day I realized they were never going to stop," Vincent whispered, never taking his eyes off the door. "Every few years, another accident, another witness who got too close to the truth. They built an empire on Melissa's grave, and they've been protecting it ever since." "That's not what I'm asking." Stallone's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Bruno's ears prick up. "How long have you been watching me specifically?" Vincent's pause was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of uncomfortable truth. "Your son's accident wasn't random, sly. The timing, the location, they needed you broken, isolated, looking for meaning in all the wrong places. Made you the perfect candidate when the time came." The storage unit seemed to tilt on its axis. Stallone's hands clenched into fists that had once been weapons, had once carried him through fights that mattered. But this wasn't a fight he could win with violence. This was something worse. A revelation that poisoned every memory, every moment of genuine grief. "You're lying." But even as he said it, pieces were falling into place. The strange circumstances around Sage's death, the way certain investigations had been quietly dropped, the feeling he'd always had that something essential was being kept from him. "They needed leverage," Vincent continued relentlessly. "Something to keep you in line if you ever stumbled onto the wrong information. Your son was collateral damage in a much larger game." Outside, Walsh was growing impatient. "We can wait all night, gentlemen. But I should mention that we've taken the precaution of securing your family's current location. Your daughter Jennifer was very cooperative once we explained the situation." The words hit Stallone like a physical blow. Everything he'd tried to protect, everyone he'd sent into hiding, it had all been anticipated, planned for, controlled from the beginning. "Now do you understand?" Vincent's voice carried a mixture of sympathy and satisfaction. "They don't just kill people anymore. Too messy, too unpredictable. They destroy them systematically, methodically, until fighting back becomes impossible." Stallone looked at the film projector, still warm from displaying Melissa's final days, at the boxes of evidence that Vincent had spent decades collecting, at the recording device capturing confessions that could topple governments. All of it orchestrated, all of it designed to lead to this moment. But something in his chest was hardening into resolve that had nothing to do with Vincent's manipulation. The rage he felt wasn't manufactured. It was his own, born from 30 years of living a lie, of being a puppet in someone else's story. "You want them destroyed," he said quietly. "I want justice for Melissa, for your son, for everyone who got in their way. And you think this recording will do it?" Vincent nodded toward the device. "This recording, combined with your testimony and the evidence in those files, it'll be enough to bring down the entire network." Stallone stood slowly, feeling every one of his 77 years, but also feeling something else, the return of the fighter who'd carried Rocky Balboa from nobody to champion. Not because Vincent had manipulated him into it, but because some truths were worth the cost of learning them. "Margaret," he called toward the door, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding movie sets and boardrooms. "Come inside. Let's finish this conversation face to face." "I don't think that's wise, Mr. Stallone." "I think it's necessary." He moved toward the door, ignoring Vincent's sharp intake of breath. "You want to know what Vincent's been telling me? You want to control how this story ends? Then let's talk like adults instead of hiding behind doors and threats." The silence stretched for long moments before he heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, Margaret Walsh stepped inside, a woman in her 60s, expensively dressed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades cleaning up other people's messes. Behind her stood two younger men in suits that probably cost more than most people's cars. The point of no return had arrived. Margaret Walsh's eyes swept the storage unit with the cold efficiency of a battlefield commander assessing terrain. She took in the film projector, the scattered evidence, Vincent crouched in the shadows with his recording device, and finally settled on Stallone himself, battered, exhausted, but standing with the kind of dangerous stillness that had made Rocky Balboa legendary. "Mr. Stallone." Her voice carried the polished authority of someone who'd spent decades making problems disappear. "You look like a man who's learned some difficult truths. I've learned I've been living in someone else's story for 30 years. Stallone kept his voice level, controlled. Behind him, he could hear Vincent's breathing, shallow with anticipation. "The question is whether you're here to write the ending, or if we're going to do this together." Walsh's smile was winter cold. "That depends entirely on your definition of this." She gestured toward Vincent without looking at him. "Has our mutual friend told you about his previous attempts at justice? The 3 journalists who suffered convenient accidents after he contacted them? The federal prosecutor whose career mysteriously imploded when he started asking the right questions?" Vincent's recording device trembled slightly in his grip. "She's lying." "Am I?" Walsh finally turned to face him directly. "Tell Mr. Stallone about Patricia Henley. Tell him about Marcus Webb. Tell him how your crusade for justice has a very specific body count." The silence that followed carried the weight of decades. Stallone watched Vincent's face crumble as the accusations hit their mark, not because they were false, but because they were true. The man who'd orchestrated this elaborate confrontation, who'd manipulated grief and guilt with surgical precision, was himself another kind of victim. "They got too close," Vincent whispered. "They were going to expose everything, but they weren't ready, didn't understand the scope of what they were fighting. So you let them die." Walsh's words cut like surgical instruments. "Just as you're prepared to let Mr. Stallone die, if it serves your greater purpose." Stallone felt something crystallize in his chest, not the manufactured rage Vincent had cultivated, but something older and more dangerous. The fighter who'd built his career on playing underdogs knew manipulation when he saw it, and he'd been surrounded by it his entire life. Hollywood was built on beautiful lies and necessary compromises, but some truths were worth dying for. "Vincent," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Walsh, "give me the recording." "Sly, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Stallone extended his hand. "You spent 30 years orchestrating this moment. My son's death, my isolation, my guilt, all of it calculated to bring us here. But you miscalculated one thing." Vincent's eyes widened with growing horror as he realized what was happening. "I'm not your puppet." Stallone's voice carried the authority that had commanded movie sets and conquered audiences worldwide. "And I'm not hers either." He took the recording device from Vincent's unresisting fingers and held it up for Walsh to see. The small red light continued blinking, capturing every word, every admission, every moment of this carefully orchestrated collapse. "Here's what's going to happen," Stallone continued, his voice filling the storage unit with quiet power. "This recording is going public, not through Vincent's network of dead journalists and compromised prosecutors, but through every media outlet, every social platform, every connection I've built over 5 decades in this business." Walsh's composure cracked slightly. "Your family will survive." The words came out like granite. "Because here's what you never understood about people like me, Margaret. We don't become icons by avoiding fights. We become icons by choosing the right ones." He turned to Vincent, and his voice softened with something that might have been pity. "You were right about the conspiracy. Right about Melissa, right about my son, right about the network of power that's been covering this up. But you were wrong about me." Vincent's face was pale, desperate. "Sly, please. I'm not doing this for you. I'm not even doing it for justice." Stallone looked at the film projector, still warm from displaying Melissa Chen's final days. "I'm doing it because some stories need to end properly, and this one's been running too long." Walsh made a subtle gesture toward the men flanking her, but Stallone was already moving. Not with the calculated violence of an action hero, but with the measured determination of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning when to fight and when to survive. Bruno, the German shepherd, erupted from his position beside the evidence boxes, not attacking but positioning himself between Stallone and Walsh's associates. 12 years of loyalty condensed into perfect protective instinct. In the chaos that followed, as expensive suits scattered and threats dissolved into panic, Stallone walked calmly toward the storage unit's exit. Vincent called after him. Walsh shouted orders that would never be followed, but none of it mattered now. The recording device in his hand contained enough truth to topple empires. And for the first time in 30 years, Sylvester Stallone was writing his own ending. 3 months later, Stallone sat on the cabin's front porch, watching Bruno chase shadows in the late afternoon light. The German Shepherd moved more slowly now, his muzzle grayer than it had been when they'd first arrived in these woods. But there was something peaceful in his movements, the contentment of a dog whose job was finally done. The media storm had been everything Stallone had expected, and nothing like he'd prepared for. The recording had indeed toppled empires, just as Vincent had predicted. Margaret Walsh was awaiting trial on conspiracy charges. 3 major studio executives had resigned in disgrace. The Melissa Chen case had been officially reopened, her death reclassified from accident to homicide. But Sage was still gone. That truth sat beside Stallone like an old companion now, familiar and permanent. The investigation into his son's death had revealed connections, financial trails, suspicious timing, pressure applied in precisely the right places. Enough to confirm Vincent's claims, not enough to bring criminal charges. Some victories, Stallone had learned, came with their own particular weight of sadness. His phone buzzed against the wooden armrest. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen, the 3rd call today. His family had forgiven him for the chaos he'd brought into their lives, had even expressed pride in his decision to expose the truth. But forgiveness and understanding were different creatures, and the distance between them felt measured in decades rather than geography. He let the call go to voicemail, as he had the others. A rustling in the tree line caught Bruno's attention, and the dog's ears perked with interest rather than alarm. Vincent emerged from the woods like a ghost materializing from memory, thinner than before, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent 30 years learning to be invisible. "Thought you might want to know," Vincent said, settling onto the porch steps without invitation. "The Chen family's finally getting their settlement. 20 million, plus a formal admission of wrongdoing." Stallone nodded but said nothing. They'd had this conversation before, in various forms. Vincent still came by sometimes, still treated him like a partner in justice rather than a victim of manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "There's talk of a documentary," Vincent continued, "about Melissa, about the cover-up. They want to interview you. Not interested, I figured. But your story, the way you brought them down, people want to hear it." Stallone finally looked at him, this man who'd orchestrated the destruction and reconstruction of his understanding of his own life. Vincent looked older now, as if exposing the truth had aged him in dog years. The righteous fire that had sustained him through 3 decades of hiding had burned out, leaving behind something that might have been peace or might have been exhaustion. "It was never my story," Stallone said quietly. "It was yours, from the beginning. I was just the leading man you cast." Vincent winced, but didn't deny it. They'd moved past denials in their strange, damaged friendship. Does that make it less meaningful? The question hung between them like smoke from an old fire. Stallone watched Bruno investigate a suspicious leaf with the intensity he'd once reserved for hunting criminals. The dog had found his peace in simpler things. "I used to think," Stallone said, "that the worst thing about Hollywood was how it turned everything into performance, made it impossible to know what was real and what was calculated for effect." He paused, watching the light filter through pine branches. "Turns out the worst thing is when the performance becomes more real than the life you were living before." Vincent stood slowly, understanding the dismissal. "For what it's worth, Sly, your son would have been proud. The way you finished this, the courage it took." "Don't." The word came out sharp enough to stop Vincent mid-sentence. "Don't tell me what Sage would have thought. You forfeited that right when you made his death part of your 30-year screenplay." The silence stretched between them until Vincent nodded and disappeared back into the trees, leaving Stallone alone with his dog in the lengthening shadows. That evening, as darkness settled over the Adirondacks like a familiar blanket, Stallone called Jennifer back. They talked about her children, about his upcoming birthday, about everything except the elephant that would always live in the room between them. But there was warmth in her voice, genuine connection beneath the careful distance. When he hung up, Bruno padded over and rested his graying muzzle on Stallone's knee. The dog's eyes held the kind of uncomplicated loyalty that Vincent's manipulation couldn't touch, that Hollywood's machinery couldn't corrupt. "Just you and me now, old friend," Stallone murmured, scratching behind Bruno's ears. Outside, the Adirondack wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful, indifferent, real. And for the first time in months, Sylvester Stallone felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The story was finished. The ending was his own.